All right, good morning. I'd like to get started. I just advise everyone we won't go later than noon so everyone can have some time to get lunch. And I don't want to bore you guys too much. But, well, hello, my name is Eric Homan. I'm an assistant professor here at the Columbus College of Art and Design, where I teach classes in video, computer animation, and motion graphics. And I want to thank all of you for coming today to see this unique documentary about how comic books are important. And before I begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors for the Visiting Artists series that we have here at CCAD, the George Siskos Endowment Fund for Visiting Artists and Lecturers, the Ohio Arts Council, and the Columbus A Renaissance Hotel. And I'd also like to thank Palmer up on the back there for helping with the presentation.
You're welcome.
And before we start today with showing this 40-minute long documentary that I worked on, I would like to first start with explaining how I got into reading comic books. And I've been collecting comic books since I was 14 years old. Being from a small town, I've always enjoyed the escapism and wonderment that comic books brought to my imagination. I really felt that they were a resource for extraordinary creative ideas. Yet as I grew older and went to college, I found myself not as interested in comic books. For one thing, I didn't have as much money to keep collecting them. Their cover price had gone up, and I couldn't afford to buy many books. I didn't have a car either, which made buying books rather difficult. And by the mid-90s, the writing on many superhero titles really left me bored as well. And I was talking to my Computer Animation 1 class this morning about one person who was mainly the reason for that. His name is Rob Liefeld. Well, everything was about how flashy the artwork could be, which was all nice until all the artwork styles started to look the same. So I left reading comic books behind for a while. I still checked out and read graphic novels from the nearby downtown Columbus Library, though. And I tried to keep up with what was going on in the field through reading various comic book magazines on them, like Wizard. And I also discovered Girls at the time, and comic books took something of a backseat for me. It didn't seem all that mature or cool to be reading funny books about super people in tights beating up each other. Yet, there was still this itch to see what I might be missing. And yet, under the superficial superhero surface of comics, there were some very interesting comic books coming out that were unlike anything in any other creative medium. Yet still, I didn't fully get back into buying many comics. That is, until I was in graduate school and had a car and stopped by some South Florida comic book stores where they were having some amazing sales on their back issues. I found mature reader books from the Vertigo imprint books called The Sandman, Doom Patrol, Shade the Changing Man, Swamp Thing, and Animal Man that catered to a more adult outlook on life. These books offered something unique, special, wild, and different that I wasn't finding in TV, video games, or movies. I also especially liked the cover artwork that I found buying a particular comic book worthwhile for that element alone. Needing inspiration from graduate art projects that I was doing, I used these comic books as a foothold into the doorways of imagination that were sometimes blocked to me. I relished in the new ways of seeing and viewing the world. I didn't copy what I was seeing and discovering, and I was applying the freedom of being able to illustrate anything in comic books into the realms of 3D animation and digital compositing. They really helped me to excel in ways that I didn't see possible. I felt that like I was drinking from an artistic fountain of youth that only a few knew about. Several years later, I took more chances with picking up various superhero titles that seemed to be more about advanced and more engaging ideas than I remember comic books for being. I discovered that comic books had undergone a series of changes where new writers had come in and revolutionized the medium. And some of you may know a few of these, like Josh Whedon, who did Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Kevin Smith, who did Clerks and Dogma, and Chasing Amy. So a lot of outside talent from the movies and the movie field came in and started working on comic books. And the diversity of styles seen in comic books was another explosion of surprises. Comic books were being colored digitally, which meant for a more mixed media and a wider range of colors and tones. It was like the world of comic books had gone from 2D to 3D in content and quality. I soon found myself collecting and reading the writers who were doing comic books just to devour as many of their crazy ideas and storylines as I could. And since I was in a minority of comic book readers, I felt like I was into something cool that other people didn't know about. It made me feel special, like knowing about something that other people had no idea existed, like a spectacular national park, a great indie band, or even the Garden of Eden. And the funny thing was, it was within a mere comic book. I just had to go and do enough research through reading comic book magazines like Wizard to find out what was going on and what was worth checking out. Then I was confident enough to start exploring on my own and see what else might be out there. And eventually I turned 30, and still I had to wonder why I kept reading comic books. Well, why do people keep watching movies or TV shows? To be entertained, for escapism, to be inspired, to feel more alive, to have fun. Comic books were still somewhat looked down on by certain groups of people, yet I felt that with a certain amount of education and self-expression, and hence why I did the following documentary about my love for comics, more people might see them as more than just superheroes. And I also wanted to give you a little background about this documentary that we're about to see. And I suppose I mainly made this documentary because there were still so many people out there who discredit comic books as something that primarily geeks and teenage males read. And I wanted to expand comics' horizons to show what a diversity of talent and creativity there is to behold. Over the years, I made journal notes of some critical and analytical feelings I had about the comic book industry in itself, and why I was reading comic books well into my 20s. I mean, shouldn't I be reading novels or something by this age? And, well, yes. But to deny myself the world of comics and graphic novels would be just as offensive as denying myself novels, because there's just so many worthy titles to read in the comic book universe. And they don't just involve superheroes either. I discovered, read, and treasured the works of such prolifically imaginative writers such as Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, and Warren Ellis that made me truly believe that there were still new ideas to be found in the art world. I've heard for many years that from my own students that there are no new ideas out there. And I just always want to tell them just to read a graphic novel written by Grant Morrison sometime, and then hopefully they'll see the light. In my writings, I've addressed how many more comics take risks since they're such a less broad medium as movies and TV. They can take more chances, and since they're a visual and text-based medium, they appeal greatly to the visual right side of the brain. So it made complete sense why someone who is artistic inclined, grown up, would gravitate towards reading comics if they also happened to have superb stories, concepts, characters, and all the emotional depth that you would normally find in great novels and critically acclaimed motion pictures. So eventually I took and edited down my journal writings into a cohesive form, recorded a narration, and put visuals to it. This project took me for the most of the summer of 2007 to complete, and it was truly a labor of love. As I was editing, I realized that I couldn't just show covers of comic book covers. I needed to recommend and highlight certain books that have garnered so much acclaim that the casual viewer might get an idea of where to start to look. In the end, I found myself with a psychoanalysis of sorts of why I personally continue to read comics, and also why the general public would want to as well. I discovered many reasons, such as making you feel young again, to just having a great story to read. And comics aren't just for kids out there. There's plenty of mature reader titles nowadays than ever before that transcend gender, race, sex, creed, and sexual orientation. There's something out there for everyone with an open enough mind to allow themselves to appreciate something new in their lives. And this documentary is about how comic books affect an artist's growth, let alone anyone with a capacity to dream and wish to fill their life with dreams again. Comic books would be an ideal place to start looking. This documentary, Comic Book Culture, was indeed a personal documentary about who I am and how comics affected me. By showing my love for comics, I wanted others to feel what I felt. I thought it was so important that I made a documentary about it. And this documentary wasn't a history of comic books, it was the essence of how comic books make you feel. I could have approached this documentary with an anonymous point of view, yet I felt that I would have depersonalized the whole experience. and that, to me, would have ruined everything special about the work. It had to be from a particular point of view, from an insider looking around, making critical observations. And this is from one fan to other fans, and even anyone curious to the medium and wants to learn more. That was my end goal for this work. Try to make it interesting, honest, truthful, entertaining, and educational to as many people as possible. So this is comic book culture that you're about to see, and I hope you enjoy the show, and afterwards there'll be a short question and answer session. So thank you. So then the rest that you're seeing here is the rest of the DVD where it has extra art galleries from different comic book series that are out there. So I just want to make one more point. There's actually two versions of this documentary. The first one that you just saw is the one with copyrighted music from Superman and Batman Begins and stuff like that. Then the other version that I made that I can actually sell is music that I got from a website called freemusic.com, where you can download certain musical sound clips of classical music or other pieces of music that almost sound like they're from Batman or Superman, so I use that for that version. So that's my two different versions that I did for this video. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer anything. Joseph, I know you do.
Quick question. Do you know about the Halo comic book series?
Yeah, there's many video game comic books out there. There's a Halo book that just came out from Marvel Comics, written by Brian Michael Bendis, who's a big superstar. He wrote for Daredevil, and I think that's it's been out for a few months now. But many video game companies have been buying up actual comic book companies for quite a while now. In the 90s, Acclaim Entertainment actually bought up Valiant comic books to buy the rights to Turok, the old character, for them, and they actually made a whole video game series that was pretty successful for that. So. Video games and movies, they're coming hand in hand. They're almost the same medium in a weird way. So, any other comments? And many of the books that you just saw up there, many of them are actually being made into movies right now. One by Mark Millar is a book called Wanted, which is being made into a movie with Angelina Jolie. That's coming out in June, I believe. And so many of these books, a lot of the writers for comic books are actually being tapped now to be working in certain TV series. Like Jeff Loeb wrote for Batman for many years, and he's a creative consultant on the TV show Heroes. Brian K. Vaughan, which I know many of my students like reading a book called Runaways, Why the Last Man. He's working on the TV series Lost now. And J. Michael Skrinsky, I'm butchering his name right now. He's the creator of Babylon 5. He's been writing for comics for quite a few years now. And he's doing a movie for Clint Eastwood now, as well as the new Will Smith movie that's coming out in a year. So I think Hollywood's actually recognizing that comic books and the writers for comic books they're a big resource, and they're actually tapping them a lot more to being made into movies. So, yeah.
I'm struck by almost all the work that you showed here, and I think that you collect is either American or English, right?
Yeah.
Are you interested in Japanese or French or?
Yeah, a few of the books I did show, manga is such a huge category, that could have been another hour. I did show like Akira and Nausicaa, and a little bit of the work of Mobius, who was a French. Yeah, no Tintin, but that's a whole area that's like, I wanted to center mainly on the American comic books, but the European stuff is like a whole other half an hour, I guess. But the stuff that I discovered when I was a teenager was a work by a French illustrator named Mobius, and some of you may know who he is. He did illustration work for the movie Tron in the early 80s. And some of the people who have been influenced by him was an illustrator named Geoff Darrow, who was recently tapped by the Wachowski brothers to design the Matrix films in the late 90s. So a lot of the influences that you see in European comic books and graphic novels through the 70s and 80s, especially in the book Heavy Metal, was being translated into a lot of manga films, and you can definitely see that in Hayao Miyazaki's work.
I think about France and Japan, I'm sure there's lots of others, and also also that kind of sense of outsiderness that you talk about in American comics, I think is not, you don't feel that.
It's not true at all, and
It feels really mainstream.
yeah, that's one comment I was going to make in there is that, only like 99% of the population don't read comic books, but in Japan or in Europe, it's perfectly normal to be on the subway or in the train reading manga. It's like reading a magazine or playing video games or whatever, watching a movie. It's perfectly normal. So it's kind of, it's evolving. I mean, comic books are definitely getting more mature. It's just a matter of getting more exposure out there.
Well, it may be, I don't mean to do all the time, but it may be the fact that this stuff is weirder too.
Yeah, I mean, there's some very straight books out there, but there's definitely some books that they're just so different and strange. And I think if you watch certain movies, they cut out a lot of the weirdness, and which is, I think, what makes them special in the first place. I mean, if you watch a movie like V for Vendetta, I mean, it's a book by Alan Moore, and they cut out almost all the subtext, all the sub-stories going on, and they just gave you basically a Cliff Notes version of the actual book. Most people know about Alan Moore, and he's definitely my favorite writer. I mean, he's a big, kind of long hair. He has these crazy scorpion rings on his fingers. He looks like a scary guy, but he's a brilliant guy as well. He did a book called The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which is a fantastic book about taking these Victorian English characters from Jules Verne and other books from that era, and doing a fictional story where they all team up like they're a superhero team. And it's a brilliant book. It has like Quartermain, and in the movie they cut out almost all the extra depth to the characters, like the Quartermain character who Sean Connery plays is a heroin addict. So they cut all that stuff out because they want to make it into a PG-13 rated film with lots of explosions and stuff. But that's a sad fact that they cut out all the fun stuff or the depth. Yeah, and also I have to make mention that Jeff Smith, who did a book called Bone and went to Ohio State University, just lives just down the block here in German Village. He's made a big name for himself as a writer and artist with his character Bone. And he later did, just last year, he did a book called Shazam. Yeah. I just like the different styles. I mean, just by looking over here, I love just like I'm doing a lot of motion graphics work right now. And right now, if I look at certain comic books, just the certain type of depth or the type of texture that they're adding to some of their work that is really affecting how I composite images together and how I take certain pictures or how I do certain types of Photoshop work. And the main thing I go for comic books is not just the visuals, but also just the main writing, just to make sure it's worthwhile reading. There's some really bad works out there, and it's a matter of knowing what's good to read. Just like, going to certain movies, you don't want to go see a really bad film. You don't want to waste your money or your time. And the best place to look, once again, if you don't have much money, downtown Columbus Library. That's where I went all the time as a student here. And they have a massive collection there of graphic novels of every type out there. Not just the mainstream stuff, but also more experimental stuff and independent books, which is what I find to be the most interesting. And that's the same thing with independent films. If you go to the Drexel Theater, you're going to see some really good stuff there compared to the Lenox. So, any other questions? Yeah.
What are your opinions on like the effects of comic books being made into movies?
I think it's a good thing because it exposes more books out there and it gets more people interested in reading certain books. So if they go see Batman Begins, or The Dark Knight, they're going to maybe go and discover certain comic books out there that they may not have known about. So I think it's a good thing about Sin City and 300 and all those films getting more exposure and being successful because it's exposing a lot more writers out there that weren't known. I mean, Frank Miller is a lot of people know who Frank Miller is now compared to 10 years ago. I mean, he actually quit comic books for a little while and did the screenplay for RoboCop 2, which was a terrible flop. And they butchered his screenplay too when they were translating it into a movie, but it took them 10 years to have a certain filmmaker like Robert Rodriguez or Quentin Tarantino to come to him and go, hey, I think your work is great, let's just translate it using digital technology onto the screen. And when the movie came out, people thought it was the most amazing visuals in years. But for people who have read comic books, they're just like, you're just translating it, and you're just using technology to do it. So some comic book readers are just going, hey, this is pretty cool. We should take some of this stuff and we can translate it into our own work and make it more visually enticing, because you can do that now with After Effects or Shake or Maya, Final Cut Pro. And that's where I'm inspired, because, you know, if you know the technology and you have inspiration out there to guide you at least, you know, then you can really improve your work and make it, and you can just make it stand out that much more. So, Dark Knight comes out in July. That's too bad about Heath Ledger. So, anyways, hope you enjoyed the show and get some inspiration.